So tonight is the last night, and next week we're going to launch onto an exciting new theme, which I'll say more about later, which is the path of desire, pleasure and beauty. Tantra for the modern world. This is clearly a must. This is and that's going to run up until Christmas, okay? And I'll link to that today. But today what we're going to do is round off our look at Buddhism, if you like, in the here and now, particularly Triratna and Sangharakshita's translation of the Dharma for the modern world. We're going to look at that with 3 short talks. So 3 people are going to give short talks on my favourite bit of Sangharakshita, my favourite bit of Sangharakshita's teaching and what it means to me. So we're going to start off with Martin, who's going to talk about the path of regular steps and the path of irregular steps. Then Bodhinaga is going to talk about finding emotional equivalents for our intellectual understanding. And then I'm going to bridge to next week by talking about the importance of desire, pleasure and beauty in the spiritual life. So first of all, Martin's going to talk about the path of regular steps and the path of irregular steps.
So yes, the path of regular steps and path of irregular steps. It's a text that's in a book called The Taste of Freedom. It's quite a short one. You can get a copy in the bookshop, but if you're quite internet savvy, on Sangharakshita's website you can download it for free. I'm going to sort of waffle through it and hopefully you'll capture why it means something to me. But Sangharakshita talks about the fact of the sort of different ways into enlightenment, and sort of one of those ways is the path of irregular steps. And he talks, it's something we'll all be sort of familiar with, because it's that sort of process for taking 2 steps forwards and then ending up taking 1 step back. So he starts off by explaining the way Buddhism came over to the West is it came in texts. So you had Victorian explorers going off to India, finding these lovely Sanskrit texts, bringing them back, translating them. And the way that the West, being quite scholarly, tried to engage with it is to think that, right, if I can read and understand all these things, then I'll sort of master it and I'll know what this Buddhism thing is about. But the issue with that approach is the text is sort of the finger pointing at the moon of enlightenment. They're not enlightenment itself. And if anyone who has heard the Heart Sutra, I don't think anyone ever really sort of understands it, having just looked at it or listened to it. So sort of from that step, we then sort of go on to sort of a path of irregular steps, trying to engage with the Dharma and finding ways into it. So to sort of illustrate this point, Sangharakshita invents a guy called John. So John has started off, he's been reading the books, so he goes and finds a meditation teacher, starts meditating, and it's fantastic, really serene, clear head, it's beautiful. But he's carrying on for about a month, and after that month, meditation goes a bit stale, and it's not quite doing it anymore. So at which point he says, right, forget this, I've got the wrong teacher, I've got the wrong meditation, go off and find somewhere else. So he goes off to find another teacher and starts off again. The teacher says, that was right, you've got the wrong meditation. You need this one, this is the one that's going to get you there. And so John starts again, and once again he hits the block and then thinks, oh no, I've done it wrong again. And we've all now had a similar sort of experience, thinking, it's mindfulness of breathing, that's going to get me somewhere. And then go, no, it's the Metta that's going to get me somewhere. And also with John, he has the rest of life coming. So you've got things like, he goes to his meditation class and he sees a beautiful lady. Wonderful, forget the Dharma, beautiful lady, go! However, all goes a bit awry. According to Sangharakshita, it goes awry. John's thinking about committing suicide. A bit dark, but either way, John gets through it. And so this carries on in all different parts of his life. So one week he's practicing the precepts, he's being kind and generous and truthful, and it's lovely. And then the next week he's got drunk at a party, he's managed to annoy all his friends, and he spends the rest of the weekend in a hazy hangover. Which once again, I'm sure some of us have definitely experienced that. What Sangharakshita is trying to make the point of is that if we do this sort of stumbling approach, we'll keep getting glimpses of something more. So we'll go on a retreat and feel really serene and blissful and enjoy it, but then sort of return to our usual habits and sort of lose that connection and lose that touch. We might have the week where we've been meditating fantastically, with once again feeling like it's really improving our health, and then we don't meditate again for a month. what Sangha is saying is that in order to sort of get sort of a consistent taste of those feelings, to have them sort of stay with us, we need to work on moving to a path of regular steps. So he breaks the path of regular steps down into sort of 3 aspects of ethics, meditation and wisdom. So if you've been on the introductory course, you may be familiar with that and have encountered it. So what Sangharakshita is saying is that by working on our ethics, becoming a more skillful person, we'll then be able to meditate more effectively and then be able to get insight into wisdom. But whereas with the path of irregular steps, we're sort of clutching, grasping at the Dharma, saying, this next textbook, this has got the secret message that is going to unlock it, or saying, if I go on this retreat, or if I disappear off to India and live under a tree for a year, that's going to fix it. Then it's just constant grasping, whereas really we need to work to getting the Dharma to sort of seep into us, to sort of be in our bones. So rather than 1 week of meditation and the rest of the month not have it, so just getting 1 meditation a week, getting something consistent so that rhythm builds up and sort of moves through us and propels us. And one of the ways that Sangharakshita says that we get that sort of propulsion and movement going is by going to refuge, to the 3 jewels of the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So the phrase going for refuge is a bit of an odd one. It sounds a bit like you're running and hiding under your mother's skirts, but it's not really what it's about. My sort of personal interpretation of it is it's sort of the things that we sort of anchor ourselves around and sort of put our hearts upon. Now in the West we've got loads of different things we use to do that. So that might be family, it might be career, you might think material wealth, or sort of artistic expression. But what Sangharakshita is trying to say is that as long as we're sort of picking things that are within the world, they're subject to sort of impermanence, subject to unsatisfactoriness, and to an extent we can't rely on them completely. Now I'm sure when I've said that, that's going to put some people's backs up, sort of the idea of I can't rely on my career or family, but at some level, part of every of us knows that a career will come to an end, and as much as our family's there for us right now, there may be a time when they'll not be, and they're people in their own right. They will keep changing and growing, and they may change into a way you don't recognise. If you told my family I'd be a vegetarian at this point, they would have laughed you out of the room. So what Sangharakshita is saying is sort of these sort of things within the world, these conditioned things, are subject to change, whereas the ideals of Buddha, Dharma and Sangha are something sort of beyond change, outside of us, because the ideal of enlightenment for all beings isn't something you can pick up or hold or grasp. It's something that's out there for all of us to realise. The Dharma isn't the textbooks you pick up, it isn't these talks, it's about how you take this information and then interact with the world, engage it, sort of bring it to life. The Buddha said that, he didn't say take my teaching as sort of a gospel, he said take my teaching and test it, see for yourself, taste it as it were. And then with the Sangha, when we say Sangha in this context, I'm not saying the person you talk to every Tuesday in your discussion group, because once again, they might not always be here, whereas us as a community, Triratna across the globe, Buddhists practicing all over, all working towards the goal of enlightenment, all supporting each other, helping each other, that's an ideal you can sort of connect with and go to refuge to. So just to sort of illustrate that, one of my best friends in this Sangha, Francis, has gone off to Adhisthana for 6 months, and I'm surprised just how much I'm missing him. But the fact that he's gone, I was just like, Sangha Jewel's gone, not back for the shrine. Kind of missing the point, because I've got all of you fantastic people here with me. So there's something that's always there regardless. But one of the challenges that sort of speaks to me about this sort of talk of going for refuge is that there's a big sort of gap at times between our sort of rational mind and our emotional mind. So for example, rationally, I agree with everything I've just told you, but I know that emotionally I'm miles off actually sort of being there. Earlier this year, I was in a relationship, and I know full well that I was trying to make a refuge of that person. I was trying to, wanting to rely on them. It then sort of led to things like, there was something about us in that whenever we were sort of together, fireworks would go off. They weren't always good fireworks, there's plenty of bad ones. when sort of the bad stuff would come up, I'd then start looking for other things to blame. So I'd start blaming my practice and saying, it's Buddhism that's stopping this relationship working. But that was never the case. I was trying to force something. I was trying to force her to be something I shouldn't have been doing. And so by going to refuge to the Three Jewels, they are something that can sort of hold that, support that, and really carry us through. And a final point that sort of Sangharakshita makes in this talk is about, or text, how you would refer to it, is about how, what is the idea of being sort of a true Buddhist. So, for example, we have this idea that, a monk in Thailand, he's a real Buddhist, and I might just be dabbling. Once again, this girl I mentioned, she said to me, when you become an order member, do you become a real Buddhist then? So which part, like, I am a real Buddhist, what are you? But part of the reason why I got so spiky is because there is a part of me that thinks, am I a real Buddhist? Am I not just someone that's dabbling and mucking about? And Sangharakshita is really clear in this talk that no one's sort of dabbling or messing about. If the Three Jewels, if the precepts are something that speaks to you, it doesn't matter how clumsy or irregular your steps are, how many mistakes you make along the way and sort of reparations. If there's a part of you inside you that actually says, yes, I one day somehow want to get to a point where I'm kind and generous to all the people that I encounter, that I find a way that words roll off my tongue in a way that's open and truthful and opens connections with others, that despite in this chaos of the world on fire with greed, hatred and delusion, I hope sometime to find serenity, peace, stillness, contentment, and mindfulness within myself. If that's something you believe in, then you're a Buddhist, regardless of how many retreats you're on, how much you're meditating, and you've got plenty of rebirths, you'll get there someday.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure what I was going to speak about this evening. And first of all, I thought, there's so many teachings of Sangharakshita's that I really appreciate and very grateful for. Which one should I talk about? And I first of all thought, I'll talk about friendship. And I was thinking it through. I can talk about friendship. I can talk about my friendship with Maitradasa, my friendship with Sangharakshita. Talk about different friends within the Sangha and how that's helped me. And then all of a sudden, I knew what I wanted to talk about. And what I wanted to talk about was this phrase, finding emotional equivalence for intellectual understanding. So finding emotional equivalence for intellectual understanding. And the reason I talk about the first bit is because what for me this is bringing out is there's different ways of knowing. There's different ways of knowing, and to begin with I was kind of thinking around different ways, different things I could talk about. And then all of a sudden I knew what I wanted to talk about. And how does that happen where we just know, rather than trying to think it through and get rational understanding? It's just suddenly we know something. And that's what I want to talk about briefly this evening. This phrase from Sangharakshita, finding emotional equivalence of our intellectual ways of understanding things. So. And I read a book, maybe a few years ago, there was a guy who I thought was American and I was told today he's Canadian, a guy called Malcolm Gladwell, and he wrote a book, it's not a very good reference, I think it's called Blink. So, in his book he talked about how we know things, and he talked about antique dealers, and they'll know straight away when they see something if it's fake or if it's real. And then after they realise that, they'll then apply some rational tests, and they'll just kind of verify what they know through the usual kind of rational tests, kind of, well, has it got this marking, this marking? But basically they get a gut instinct, they know straight away whether something is real or fake. And he also made the assertion that heart doctors will also make a diagnosis straight away. They'll have a sense of whether somebody is, what's wrong with them straight away. And then this will be after years of training and experience, they'll kind of just know And and then they'll apply the usual tests after that just to kind of reassure themselves, just to kind of, just make sure they have got it right. But there's this sense in which we kind of know something, not rationally, not intellectually, we just know it. We kind of intuitively, more emotionally know something's true. And that's really important when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to the Dharma. Because in the West, we, however it's happened maybe from Greek traditions or Roman traditions, but we split out the idea of head and heart has become separated. We've got the idea that we kind of know things with our head, and then we feel emotions with our heart. And what's happened, unfortunately, is we've kind of played down and dismissed the heart aspect of knowing. It's almost like our emotions are not to be trusted. We kind of, not to be experienced even. We just kind of, our emotions are troublesome. And in the West, we're dominated by thinking, by our rational mind, by trying to understand things intellectually. And in Buddhism, there's a word chitta, C-I-T-T-A, the word chitta. And that means both heart and mind. It means both thinking and emotions. So in Buddhism, it's not these two aspects of our being aren't divided and separated. They're one function. The function chitta is to kind of think and feel together, it's conjoined. So the fact that in the West we've separated out these two functions of thinking and emotion, it can lead to some dangers, actually, some problems, some dangers. So we can kind of understand something rationally and cognitively, but that isn't the same as knowing it with your whole being. It's when we really, really fully know something with our whole being, we know it to be true. That's the kind of wisdom that we are looking for. So I wanted to look, just to illustrate this, I'm just going to talk briefly, just by looking at one particular Buddhist list of something we can understand, and just talk about kind of how we could understand that intellectually, cognitively, and also how we can understand it emotionally, and how that might look and feel differently. So I'm going to look at the list of the 3 lakshanas. I haven't got a flip chart, I'm afraid, but we're familiar with the 3 lakshanas because we look at them on the beginner's course and the following course. So the 3 factors of conditioned existence, the 3 kind of marks of conditioned existence. And the first thing is that insubstantiality, the fact that we basically exist connected with everything else around us and dependent on everything else around us. So insubstantiality. And also dukkha, the truth of dukkha, that we experience suffering. And it's our approach to things in life and reality that causes this suffering. And then also the truth of impermanence, that anything we can think of, absolutely anything we can think of, is constantly changing. There's just this constant flux and process of change. So this is a list of 3 things that we can know. And we can know them intellectually, but we can also know them with our whole being. We can know them emotionally, and they'll look and feel very different. I suppose the danger, if we only know something intellectually or cognitively, it can end up with kind of more of a kind of cold feel to it, almost like a kind of, sometimes kind of a dismissive or cruel kind of feeling to it. There's not the kind of emotional connectivity with the world and with other people around us. So I was speaking to a friend yesterday, and he was saying that he'd experienced some real emotional difficulty with a relationship. And somebody had said to him, it's just impermanence, kind of things change, and, which is true, it is due to impermanence, but it's not a kind of, it's a very different way to understanding the truth of impermanence emotionally and having that kind of emotional connection with people. What else did I want to say? The idea, I'm having a difficult time, and then somebody might come and say to me, your emotions are just illusory, they're insubstantial. There's nothing kind of substantial about your emotions, so you don't worry about it. And it's quite, it can be quite a kind of dismissive way of responding. If there's an understanding just with the head, just a kind of cognitive understanding, it could lead to kind of perhaps a dismissive way of connecting with people, relating to people. And the Buddha, when he saw reality, he described an experience when he saw reality, when he saw the truth of things, that he trembled, he quivered, he shook with compassion, with feeling for the beings. There's this word that he used called anukampa, that the Buddha physically shook, he physically trembled with just connecting, resonating with the suffering of other beings, that he could see, he could feel and see how beings suffered and how they caused themselves to suffer in a way. Their suffering was caused by their own mind, and how the kind of tragedy of this. It wasn't a kind of cold, rational understanding. He trembled. He kind of physically shook with this resonance with all beings. So, very briefly, I think the kind of understanding of an Atman, to understand an Atman, in that same way as the antique dealer or the doctor who just knows something to be true, to just know an Atman to be true with your whole being. I think the emotional experience of that would be gratitude, actually, or one of the emotional experiences would be gratitude. Just to realise that you are basically everything you have, you rely on other people, everything you consider that you own, everything that you eat, everything that you understand, all is derived from other people. It's derived from other people, it's derived from the universe, from the world. So to really clearly know that and see that emotionally, you'd feel tremendous gratitude, just amazing gratitude for the people who have made that possible. And the same way, to have some kind of spiritual breakthrough, some kind of spiritual progress, what you'd experience emotionally would be gratitude, just a sense of the people who made this possible, the teachers who've taught me, the Sangha, the Centre, the person who founded the tradition, the Buddha, Sangharakshita. There'd just be a sense of, not that I've done this, I've achieved this. If you really see your own insubstantiality, it wouldn't be I've achieved this, it would be I'm overwhelmingly grateful, just very, very grateful. So gratitude would be an aspect of, an emotional equivalent to the intellectual understanding of an Atman. It'd be one of them at least. And dukkha, to see the truth of dukkha, to know the truth of dukkha emotionally. I think initially, to begin to understand it, there would be grief, there would be sadness, emotionally to see the truth of dukkha. It would be quite a painful experience just to really know the suffering of beings, and to know, just to start to come to terms with your own suffering. It would be quite a painful experience. Maybe that's why we want this, the cognitive experience of it actually might be quite attractive, because to actually feel dukkha, to really know dukkha, it would be grief, there would be sadness, there would be pain involved. But then to kind of see that with the perspective of wisdom as well, there would be compassion, as just as the Buddha trembled and quivered and shook with the suffering of beings, there would be compassion if you really kind of felt emotionally the truth of dukkha, that beings suffer and why they suffer. And then with impermanence, I think with impermanence, to see that, to know that emotionally, rather than being kind of swept away with the bliss of the moment, you're having a really good time, and rather than kind of getting captivated too much and lost in that, and rather than also getting drowned in a really difficult experience of dukkha, well, there would just be an equanimity, there'd be an emotional equanimity. That would be the emotional experience, I think, or part of the emotional experience would just be a sense of equanimity, sereneness, kind of, you could call it, describe it as a tranquility, a positivity, despite the ups and downs of life. So you could see how just knowing something intellectually is very, very different to those emotional experiences. And so Sangharakshita had this, I think, very important aphorism. There's a lot of aphorisms. I only found out what an aphorism was through getting involved with True Atman. There's so many of Sangharakshita's aphorisms. But this is a very important one, which is that we need to find emotional equivalents to the intellectual understandings. And the reason for that is because, as I said, in the West, we're very, very focused on the mind and on knowing and on understanding. But actually, what we're not so good on in the West, and what we really need to do is to feel things. We need to feel the truth emotionally, and then combine the seeing and the kind of rational knowing together, because that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is the kind of conjoining, combining of seeing something clearly and feeling it deeply. So just to conclude, how just a little bit about how to go about doing that. And well, firstly, just to say, we need to have our emotions engaged. That's really important. So practices like the metta bhavana help to engage the emotions. And we talk about friendship, which is another topic I was going to talk about, but we really emphasise friendship in Triratna again because it helps in different ways. Actually, you get your buttons pressed, and this is an important. You kind of, if you're committed to a friendship and you find out where your emotions are, you kind of find, your buttons get pressed. And also, it's a platform for cultivating a safe platform for cultivating positive emotions, warmth, metta, kindness, love, openness, trust. And friendship is really important for kind of getting our emotions up and running. And then it's really important just to start where we are with emotions, because when we think of insubstantiality or no self, actually what we might emotionally be experiencing is jealousy and competitiveness and pride. Like with this, speaking, this is what I experience. And so these, not always this sense of my insignificance and gratitude to other people. So we need to, rather than cognitively thinking, well, they're not what I'm supposed to be feeling, so I'm going to try and feel something else. We need to start with the emotions that are there and feel those fully, feel those deeply. And then they can transform, they'll transform with practice, with our ethical and meditation practice. And studying, rather than studying on our own, reading and kind of, if we're someone who is cognitive, studying with other people in groups is a very good way as well of getting other people's perspectives, but also getting our emotions involved, because again our buttons will get pressed. If we're studying in groups, our emotions will get involved. So engaging the emotions is very, very important. I think Vadanya is going to talk about pleasure and beauty in the arts, and that's also a really important way of engaging the emotions. But in terms of wisdom, trying to get, I think, just going right back to what I started to talk about, just this knowing what you think, or really, knowing with your whole being what you want to say or what you believe. Very briefly, the Buddha talked about 3 levels of wisdom, 3 levels of knowing, and the first one is a kind of cognitive knowing, where you hear or you read something, and the second level is where you kind of you reflect on it, you take it away and you reflect and you kind of chew it over and you live it out and you test it out against your experience. And then the third level is you become that, you really know it with your bones, you kind of know it with your whole being. So to go from the first to the third, that kind of cognitive, to the really knowing something in your bones, there's this stage of reflection. And so I just want to end by recommending a book by Ratnaguna in the library, in the bookshop, called The Art of Reflection, because he's just written a really great practical guide about how we can know something emotionally, how we can know it with our depths. How, in a way, it's a crucial skill, a crucial art to learn how to kind of bring the heart and the head together with our knowing. So read The Art of Reflection. So the importance of finding an emotional equivalent to an intellectual understanding.
So the aspect of Sangharakshita's approach to the Dharma that I'd like to focus on is the emphasis he places on desire and pleasure and beauty. I was tempted again to talk about friendship and Sangha, but that's what I'm going to talk about, because I think we very often pick up a wrong attitude to pleasure in the spiritual life, and that sort of spills over to our attitude to desire. And if we get that wrong attitude, we can end up actually making ourselves more miserable with the spiritual life rather than happier. Nirvana paramang sukham. Nirvana is supreme bliss, and we're not going to get supreme bliss by making ourselves miserable. And I think it's really quite common for us in the modern West to think that if we're really living a spiritual life, pleasure is bad. Desire is bad. How many times have I heard someone say, but the Dharma's about getting beyond desire. Getting beyond desire, and you will sit there, and you will sit there, and you will sit there, and you will never move, because desire is what moves us. And I think this idea that pleasure is bad, desire is bad, is quite a common attitude among Buddhists, and maybe among other spiritual traditions as well. I think it stems from a wrong understanding of Buddhism from those people who just read the text, actually, who didn't have much connection with the tradition. I think it stems from a wrong understanding of Buddhism. And also a sort of hangover in our culture from a sort of joy-denying version of Protestant Christianity, which can be around, which has sometimes been quite strong. So that we can think that the spiritual life is all about denying ourselves pleasure, and that beauty and our response to it just is out of place in the spiritual life. But we are creatures of desire. According to the Dharma, we are creatures of the desire realm. That means that we are beings of desire. That's the sort of beings we are. The desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid what is unpleasant, these are the things that drive us all the time. From the minute we get up in the morning, we are acting on desire for pleasure and desire to avoid what is unpleasant. So we get up in the morning, we desire to avoid the unpleasant sensation of being really embarrassed, not being able to get that word out. We desire to avoid the unpleasant sensation of a full bladder, so we go to the loo. We desire to avoid the unpleasant sensation of hunger, so we plan breakfast. We desire a pleasant sensation, so we make ourselves a nice breakfast, rather than a crust of bread and a glass of water. We desire to avoid the unpleasant sensation of getting wet, so we dress appropriately for the weather. And so it goes on all day. A lot of our desires are more subtle than that, more complex than that. So we go to work and we desire the pleasant sensation of achieving something positive, of making something happen. Or we desire to avoid the unpleasant sensation of being blamed for something going wrong at work. Or we desire the pleasant sensation of people liking us and approving of us and praising us. And so it goes on throughout the day. Everything we do is motivated by desire for pleasant sensations of various sorts and to avoid unpleasant sensations of various sorts. We are constantly acting on those desires. And if we try to deny that, if we pretend that we aren't creatures of the desire realm, we shut off the forces that drive us forward. We won't move. We stagnate, we stall, we get dry, joy dries up, we're no fun anymore, and we're not much use to ourselves or to others, because we just sit there. So we absolutely need desire. Desire for pleasure. Pleasure is not the problem. Pleasure is not the problem. If there's a problem, it's our usual approach to pleasure. So I think there's a few things wrong with our usual approach to pleasure. For one thing, we usually, very often, go for short-term superficial pleasures rather than deeper long-term pleasure. So the smoker, I'm sorry, my introduction, the smoker, I promised I wouldn't use smoking as an analogy, but the smoker goes for the short-term pleasure of a cigarette rather than the deeper, longer-term pleasure of health, feeling good about themselves, self-esteem, feeling in control. When we eat junk food, we go for the short-term pleasure of the immediate food and, again, ignore the longer-term pleasures. Of being fit and healthy, we avoid the unpleasant sensation of exercise, for example, rather than going for the pleasant sensation of being fit. That's one problem. It's often very short-sighted. A second problem with our usual approach to pleasure is that it's often usually centred on lower animal drives, if you like. To put it crudely, a lot of our pleasure, a lot of our desire is centred on what we can eat, own, and have sex with. That sort of keeps us. That keeps us in a lower realm. All too often, our desire is focused on sort of lower realms rather than beauty or being in higher mental states or positive self-esteem. And personally, I can sometimes find this quite shocking about myself, that I'll prefer these sort of lower animal realm pleasures to higher pleasures, if you like. So it's quite frequently happened to me that I've been on retreat And maybe it's been late afternoon and we've had an afternoon meditation. And I've sat on after this afternoon meditation. I've been really enjoying a beautifully calm, almost blissful state in meditation. And then the bell rings for dinner. Zoom! I'm in the dining room. Give me a choice between dinner and dhyana, and I will choose dinner every time. So, yeah. And then I drop down. I drop down from one level. I mean, traditionally in Buddhism, that pleasure of meditation is godlike. I drop down from that to animal-like. So that's another problem. A third problem is that we usually tend to be very sticky about our pleasures. We don't kiss the joy as it flies, in Blake's terms. He says, he who grabs to himself a wig-ed joy he who grabs to himself a joy does the wig-ed life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies, lives in eternity's sunrise. So often our approach to pleasure squeezes the life out of pleasure. So there are all these problems with pleasure. And I think these are the reasons that many spiritual traditions emphasize, seem to see pleasure as a problem and emphasize renunciation. And okay, we do need an element of renunciation in our life. We need to free ourselves up from sort of lower realm pleasures in order to experience higher realm pleasures, in order to look for happiness where it can really be found. But renunciation is not an end in itself. Renunciation is a means to an end. And the end is to actually experience more, deeper pleasure from a different source. It's not like renunciation and giving ourselves a hard time is an end in itself. So we need to gradually free ourselves from those lower, sticky pleasures, but without beating ourselves up, without guilt. And we need to gradually coax our pleasures to a higher level so that we're experiencing pleasure from different things. Nurturing the pleasure we get from being ethical. Nurturing the pleasure we get from friendship, from having a meaningful life, from feeling good about ourselves, from positive mental states, generally and in meditation, from appreciating the beauty of the world and other people, from the arts, from music. And not seeing this is a real problem. I think it's a real problem for a lot of us, that we don't see that approach to the spiritual life. Over and over again, people have said to me things like, I need to give up climbing, or playing the guitar, or all sorts of really quite positive things, because it's distracting me from the spiritual life. And I go, whoa, I mean, we need these sources of pleasure. Don't give up those things because they're distracting you. Use those things as ways into the spiritual life. Use the pleasure and the beauty that you can derive from that as ways in. Or else people say things like, well, people are only generous because it makes them feel good. As though, because it makes us feel good, we shouldn't do it. As though the only things that are ethical are things that make us feel bad. If it doesn't cause us pain, it's not ethical. But if we take that attitude, we're never going to be motivated to be ethical. It's great that generosity gives us pleasure, or that being skillful gives us pleasure, and of course it makes us feel good to be generous, because it connects us to what's highest in us. It expresses what's highest in us. It connects us to something beautiful that in a way is beyond our usual self. The enlightened mind, if you like. It makes us feel good about ourselves, not in any arrogant way, but it gives us a positive self-esteem. We need to use that. We need to use the fact that following the spiritual life gives us pleasure. Being ethical gives us pleasure. Meditation gives us pleasure. So according to Sangharakshita, and I think this is just wonderful that he's really emphasised this, we've got to find pleasure in the spiritual life. And one of the ways we do that is through our response to beauty. Responding to beauty is highly pleasurable. Nirvana Paramang Sukha. Nirvana is supreme bliss. Nirvana is the ultimate pleasure. It's the pleasure of responding to the beauty of the spiritual world, the spiritual realm, if you like. And Nirvana is not somewhere else. It's here. Nirvana is here, if only we could see it. We need to train ourselves to see through the veil that our delusion spreads over reality, to see through that to the radiant spiritual reality beyond, the beauty of that. So Thomas Traherne, an English poet and religious writer, said, if we don't see transcendental beauty here, we will not see it anywhere. Right? So if we're going to see the transcendental beauty of Nirvana, we need to start by seeing the beauty here. We need to start here. We need to train ourselves to see this deeper beauty, this higher beauty, to connect with this beauty, to love that beauty more and more, to get pleasure from it. So that means looking at other people, seeing the beauty in other people and enjoying that, seeing the beauty in the world around us and enjoying that, learning to appreciate the arts, music, or anything that sort of glimmers through to us. So whenever we see that beauty through the veil glimmer through in other people, in an ethical life, in meditative states, in the sky, in the sea, in the hills, in the forests, in music, in the art, in architecture, in the flaking paint on an old door, those are all something deeper can be shining through all of those things. And we need to just make it part of our spiritual life to see that more and more, to be able to notice that more and more. Of course, meditation is a great help in this because we refine our sensibilities. When we meditate, I mean, I think a number of people have said this, you can meditate and afterwards the world can look different. It's as though you walk out into a different world. You sat down with a slightly grey, dim world, and you get up, and there's a bright and beautiful world. It helps us to sort of break through that veil. So, I think it's one of the wonderful things that Sangharakshita has done for us, in a way, is to get us out of this very negative approach that we could adopt to the spiritual life, where I've got to give everything I enjoy up, and the world is ugly, and being really spiritually seeing just sort of how ugly it all is. We've broken out. I think it's really useful, it's really essential to us that he's taken us away from that and said, hey, no, see how beautiful things are, see how beautiful other people are. Use pleasure as a motivator, because without pleasure you're not going to get anywhere. Use pleasure, use beauty and the desire for beauty and the sort of connection we have, the sense of connection we have with something higher as the driving force in the spiritual life. That's going to be the way towards the ultimate pleasure and the ultimate beauty of nirvana, not making ourselves really miserable. So this is what our next Sangha Night theme is going to be about. I was listening to a series of talks recently from Subhuti and Padmavajra, in which Subhuti says that Sangharakshita has offered us a Vajrayana for the modern world, a tantric Buddhism for the modern world. Vajrayana is a style of Buddhism that is all about using desire, using pleasure to propel us towards enlightenment. And hey, we're not going to adopt the sort of Vajrayana approach of some medieval culture, but there's an awful lot in the Vajrayana approach that we can pick out from the traditional approaches and we can apply in our practice, and we really need to do it. We really need to develop a sort of Vajrayana, a pleasure-based Dharma, beauty-based Dharma for the modern world. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next 3 months. We're going to be looking at the path of magic, pleasure and beauty, Tantra for the modern world. So I hope to see you next week, because that should be really good fun.